Miss Marple and the death announced in the newspaper. Chapter 1. The advertisement the whodunits. Morning of April 3rd dawned with all the predictable charm of an English spring day in St. Mary Mead. Daffodils nodded in cottage gardens. The postman made his rounds with his usual observations about the weather, and Miss Jane Marple settled into her favourite chair by the window with a cup of tea and the morning paper. It was Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, who first brought the curious advertisement to Miss Marple's attention, though Miss Marple had already read it twice herself with growing interest. "Have you seen this, Jane?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop burst through the door with characteristic energy, her hat askew and her cheeks flushed. "In the Chipping Cleghorn Gazette, the personal notices section." Miss Marple looked up with mild blue eyes that missed very little. "The announcement about little paddocks? Yes, I saw it. Most unusual." The advertisement read simply, "A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, April 5th, at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. Friends, please accept this. The only intimation." "It must be some sort of party game," Mrs. Dane Calthrop declared, settling herself uninvited on the sofa. "Letitia Blacklock has always been rather original. Perhaps it's a murder mystery evening. One of those theatrical affairs where everyone plays detective." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, though her tone suggested she found this explanation less than satisfactory. She had known enough of human nature in her 70-odd years to recognize that what appeared whimsical on the surface often concealed something considerably darker beneath. Letitia Blacklock was a relative newcomer to St. Mary Mead, having taken up residence at Little Paddocks some 18 months previous. A handsome woman in her 60s with iron-grey hair and a commanding presence, she had quickly established herself as a respectable, if somewhat reserved, member of village society. She lived quietly with her companion, Dora Bunner, known to everyone as Bunny, and employed a couple named Mitzi and Patrick Simmons to manage the household. By tea-time that afternoon, the advertisement had become the sole topic of conversation in every drawing-room and shop in the village. Miss Marple received no fewer than 4 visitors, each eager to discuss the mystery and, more importantly, to discover whether they might expect an invitation to whatever entertainment Miss Blacklock had planned. "I suppose one couldn't simply arrive uninvited," Miss Weatherby ventured hopefully, perched on the edge of Miss Marple's best chair. "After all, it does say, 'Friends, please accept this.' The only intimation." "That would be most irregular," Miss Marple replied gently, though she privately suspected that several villagers would find excuses to be in the vicinity of Little Paddocks come Friday evening. Colonel Easterbrook, a red-faced retired military man with an enthusiasm for amateur dramatics, had his own theory. "Treasure hunt, mark my words. Blacklock's hidden something valuable about the house, and we're all meant to search for it. The murder will be purely metaphorical. You know, murder the mystery, solve the clues, that sort of thing." His wife, Laura, nodded vigorously, her carefully waved hair bouncing with the motion. "Oh, how exciting. I do hope we're included. We've been so kind to Miss Blacklock since she arrived. I made sure to invite her to the church fete organizing committee." Miss Marple made non-committal sounds of agreement, her knitting needles clicking steadily. She was working on a baby's booty for her great-niece, though her mind was far from the pattern. There was something about the wording of that advertisement that troubled her, though she couldn't quite place what it was. That evening, as the sun set behind the church spire and cast long shadows across the village green, Miss Marple walked slowly past Little Paddocks. It was a substantial house, built of mellow red brick with generous windows and a well-maintained garden. Lights glowed warmly from the ground floor windows, and she could see figures moving about within. Nothing appeared amiss, yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by decades of observing her fellow creatures, whispered that something was decidedly wrong. She thought of old Mrs. Harbottle in the village of Much Benham, who had organised a joke funeral for herself, only to be found genuinely deceased 3 days later. She thought of young Tommy Pierce, who had cried wolf so often about burglars that no one believed him when real thieves finally came. Human nature, Miss Marple had long ago concluded, had a peculiar way of transforming jest into earnest, and pranks into tragedy. "You're being fanciful, Jane," she told herself firmly, turning back toward home. "It's simply a party game, just as everyone says." But she didn't believe it for a moment. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth. By 6 o'clock, several villagers had found transparent excuses to be near Little Paddocks. The Easterbrooks had been invited by Miss Blacklock herself, or so they claimed. Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd, who lived together at Boulders, had received what they described as a personal telephone call. Even young Edmund Swettenham and his novelist mother had decided to drop by, purely out of neighbourly concern, naturally, Miss Marple, who had received no invitation and would not have dreamed of imposing, settled herself in her garden with a clear view of the lane leading to Little Paddocks. Her nephew Raymond had once accused her of being impossibly nosy, but Miss Marple preferred to think of it as taking a reasonable interest in her surroundings. At precisely 6:28 p.m, she heard the church clock begin its chime. At 6:30, she heard something else entirely. A sharp crack that she recognized immediately, having heard it once before when poor Colonel Bantry's gamekeeper had accidentally discharged his rifle near the churchyard. A gunshot, and then, carried clearly on the evening air, the sound of screaming. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. Miss Marple was on her feet at once, her knitting forgotten on the garden bench, her heart hammered in her chest, but her mind remained remarkably clear. She had expected something, though what exactly she couldn't have said, but not this, not an actual gunshot. By the time she reached the gate of Little Paddocks, others were already spilling out into the lane. Colonel Easterbrook emerged first, his military bearing somewhat compromised by his ashen complexion. His wife followed, clutching his arm and making small, distressed sounds. "What happened?" Miss Marple asked quietly, though she could guess well enough. "Someone shot at us," Mrs. Easterbrook gasped. "An actual gun, in the dark. We could all have been killed." Inside the house, chaos reigned. Miss Marple slipped in among the confused crowd gathering in the hall. The sitting-room door stood open, and she could see Letitia Blacklock seated in an armchair, her face pale but composed, while Bunny Bunner fluttered around her like an agitated moth. "The lights went out," Colonel Easterbrook was explaining to anyone who would listen. "We were all gathered in the sitting-room. Miss Blacklock had provided drinks and sandwiches, very civilized, when suddenly, at 6:30 exactly, everything went dark, and then a torch beam shone in the doorway, and a voice said, 'Stick 'em up!' just like something from a gangster film. And then, bang, bang, 2 shots right at Miss Blacklock. Did anyone see who it was? This came from Edmund Swettenham, a young man with untidy hair and ink-stained fingers, who wrote poetry when he wasn't helping his mother with her detective novels. "Too dark," Miss Hinchcliffe said gruffly. She was a tall, weathered woman who dressed in tweeds and spoke in short, declarative sentences. "Torch in our eyes. Blinded us all." Miss Murgatroyd, her gentle companion, nodded vigorously. It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. Poor Miss Blacklock. The bullet grazed her ear. There's blood on her collar." Miss Marple moved quietly to Miss Blacklock's side. Indeed, there was a thin line of blood on the woman's neck, just below her left ear. "A very near miss, my dear Miss Blacklock," Miss Marple said softly. "Should someone not call for Dr. Haydock? And the police?" "Patrick has already telephoned," Miss Blacklock replied. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noticed the tremor in her hands. "Inspector Craddock is on his way from Melchester. Dr. Haydock as well." "Did you recognize the voice?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Miss Blacklock shook her head. "No, it was muffled somehow, deliberately disguised, I should think." "A man's voice, though?" I'm not entirely certain. It was rough, coarse, but whether naturally so or artificially made to sound that way." She trailed off, pressing a handkerchief to her ear. Bunny Bunner, who had been hovering anxiously, suddenly spoke up. "It's that dreadful Swiss woman, Mitzi. She's always been peculiar, muttering to herself in the kitchen. Foreigners, you know, one never can tell what they might do. And she was terribly angry yesterday when Letty told her the roast was overcooked." "Bunny, really?" Miss Blacklock protested weakly. But the seed had been planted. Miss Marple watched as several of the gathered guests began nodding to one another. Mitzi, the refugee cook with her volatile temperament and imperfect English, made a convenient suspect. "Where is Mitzi now?" Colonel Easterbrook demanded. "Locked in her room, having hysterics," Patrick Simmons announced, appearing in the doorway. He was a pleasant-looking young man in his late 20s, with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Claims someone tried to murder her, can you imagine? Though how she worked that out from the kitchen, I can't say. "And where were you when the lights went out?" Mrs. Easterbrook asked with sudden suspicion. Patrick's smile faltered. "In the study, actually. I'd gone to fetch more cigarettes. The lights went out, I heard the shots, and I came running. Found the sitting room in absolute pandemonium, and the front door standing wide open. The intruder escaped through the front door. Then, Miss Marple observed. Must have done," Patrick agreed, "though how he got in without any of us noticing is beyond me." Dr. Haydock arrived shortly after, a brisk, practical man who examined Miss Blacklock's injury with efficient concern. "You've had a very close call, Letitia. Another inch to the right, and we'd be looking at something far more serious." Inspector Craddock appeared half an hour later. A young man for his position, Miss Marple thought, but with intelligent eyes and a methodical manner that she approved of. He listened carefully to each witness's account, taking detailed notes. The stories were remarkably consistent. The lights had gone out at precisely 6:30 p.m., just as the advertisement had predicted. A figure had appeared in the doorway with a torch. The voice, male probably, but muffled, had said something about sticking up hands. 2 shots had been fired. Then the figure had fled, and the lights had come back on moments later. "The fuse box," Patrick explained. "Someone had simply switched the main lever. I turned it back on once I realized." "And where is this fuse box located?" Inspector Craddock asked. "In the passage just outside the kitchen. Anyone could have accessed it." Inspector Craddock's expression suggested he found this detail significant. So someone familiar with the house, then? Someone who knew where to find the fuse box in the dark? A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone present was thinking the same thing. The murderer, or attempted murderer, had been someone inside Little Paddocks. Someone who knew the house. Someone, perhaps, still among them. Miss Marple said nothing, but her keen eyes moved from face to face, noting expressions, observing reactions. She was reminded of the time young Grace Morley had staged her own robbery to collect the insurance money, gathering her friends around her as witnesses while her accomplice did the deed. But who, in this case, was the accomplice? And more importantly, who was the intended victim? And why? Chapter 3. Early investigation. Inspector Craddock established himself in Miss Blacklock's study, interviewing each witness separately, while Sergeant Fletcher examined the sitting room for evidence. Miss Marple, whom no one quite had the heart to send away, made herself useful by helping Bunny Bunner prepare tea for everyone. It was remarkable, she reflected, how often the simple act of making tea placed one in the perfect position to observe and overhear. "Poor Letty," Bunny whispered, as she arranged cups on a tray with trembling hands. "To think that someone actually tried to kill her, and in her own home. Who could possibly want to harm such a wonderful, generous woman?" Had Miss Blacklock mentioned receiving any threats? Miss Marple asked gently, reaching for the sugar bowl. "Any unusual letters or telephone calls?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing." Bunny's eyes filled with tears. "Though I suppose one never knows what enemies one might have made in the past. Letty worked for many years in a financial capacity. Something to do with investments and estates. Very responsible position. Perhaps someone lost money and blamed her. This was interesting." Miss Marple filed it away carefully. "How long have you known Miss Blacklock, Miss Bunner?" "Oh, since we were girls. We went to school together, though we rather lost touch over the years. I had a small income, you see, from my father, and I managed quite well. But then there were some unfortunate investments. My broker gave me very bad advice, and I found myself in rather reduced circumstances." She lowered her voice. "Letty took me in just like that. Didn't hesitate for a moment. I don't know what would have become of me otherwise." Patrick Simmons appeared in the kitchen doorway, startling them both. "Inspector wants to see you next, Bunny. Best not keep him waiting." After Bunny hurried away, Patrick leaned against the counter with studied casualness. "Quite the excitement, isn't it? Poor Aunt Letty. Though I suppose I shouldn't call her that. She's actually my mother's cousin, which makes her my second cousin or first cousin, once removed, or some such complicated relation." "You live here with Miss Blacklock?" Miss Marple inquired. "For the moment. I'm between positions, as they say, trying to decide what to do with my life." He smiled charmingly. "Aunt Letty has been very patient with me. Very generous, really. And your friend, Mr. Simmons, is it?" "My sister, actually, Julia. We're twins, though not identical, obviously." He laughed. "She's upstairs lying down. All this upset has given her one of her headaches." Miss Marple carried the tea tray into the sitting room, where she found Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd huddled together on the sofa, speaking in low tones. "Don't like to say it," Miss Hinchcliffe was muttering, "but timing is suspicious. Very suspicious." "Oh, Hinch, surely not," Miss Murgatroyd protested. "She seems so upset." "Best actress I've ever seen, if that's the case. But mark my words, Murgatroyd, something's not right about that girl." They fell silent as Miss Marple approached, but not before she'd registered their meaning. "Which girl?" "Julia Simmons, who had conveniently been absent from the scene. Or perhaps Mitzi, the excitable cook." Mrs. Swettenham swept in at that moment, her novelist's instincts clearly aroused by the drama. "Inspector Craddock seems very thorough," she announced to the room at large. "He asked me the most penetrating questions about exactly where I was standing and what I could see. Of course, I couldn't see anything. None of us could, with that torch shining directly in our eyes. Very clever, really, from a criminal's perspective." "Mother writes detective stories," Edmund explained to Miss Marple unnecessarily. "She's always analysing crimes." "And this one is fascinating," Mrs. Swettenham continued enthusiastically. "The newspaper advertisement. That's the really intriguing element. Why announce a murder in advance? It's almost as though the perpetrator wanted witnesses. Or wanted to make it appear theatrical. Miss Marple suggested quietly, so that no one would take it seriously. Mrs. Swettenham's eyes lit up. Precisely. Oh, that's very good. I must remember that for my next book. Make the real crime look like a game, so everyone's guard is down. Miss Marple excused herself and drifted toward the hallway, where she encountered Inspector Craddock emerging from the study with a thoughtful expression. "Forgive me, Inspector," she said diffidently, "but I wonder if you've examined the door through which the intruder supposedly escaped." "The front door? Yes, it was found standing open." "But was it unlocked before the incident? Or did someone unlock it during the confusion?" Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Now that's an interesting question, Miss Marple, Jane Marple. I live just down the lane." She paused delicately. "It's only that in my experience, front doors in villages like St. Mary Mead are often left unlocked during social gatherings. But if this door was locked, and someone unlocked it after the shooting, well, that might suggest the escape was staged, suggesting the shooter never left the house at all." Craddock finished. "Yes, I had considered that possibility. Unfortunately, no one can remember with certainty whether the door was locked or not." A cry from upstairs interrupted them. "My pearls! They're gone! Someone's stolen my pearls!" It was Julia Simmons, standing at the top of the stairs in a dressing gown, her face flushed with indignation. She was strikingly attractive, Miss Marple noted, with dark hair and dramatic features that would have looked at home on a film screen. Patrick rushed to the foot of the stairs. "Julia, what are you talking about?" "My pearl necklace. The 3-strand one that belonged to grandmother. It was in my jewellery box this afternoon, and now it's gone." Inspector Craddock's expression suggested this was an unwelcome complication. "You're certain it hasn't simply been misplaced?" "I'm not an idiot, Inspector. Someone came into my room while we were all downstairs and took it. They used the shooting as a distraction, don't you see? The whole thing was just a robbery." Bunny Bunner gasped. "Oh, but that makes perfect sense. Someone wanted to rob the house and staged this dreadful scene to keep us all occupied while they searched the bedrooms." Miss Marple watched as relief spread across several faces. A robbery was so much more palatable than a murder attempt, so much less personal, so much less frightening. But Miss Marple found herself unconvinced. She thought of the blood on Letitia Blacklock's collar, the bullet that had come within an inch of killing her. That had been no distraction. That had been entirely real. Someone, she was quite certain, had indeed tried to commit murder this evening. And whoever it was remained somewhere close by, waiting for another opportunity. Chapter 4. First suspects. By the following morning, the entire village had settled upon a theory. Miss Marple heard it first from her maid, Cherry Baker, who heard it from the postman, who heard it from Mrs. Butt at the bakery. "It's that Mitzi, Miss," Cherry announced, dusting the sitting room with more enthusiasm than precision. "Everyone says so. Foreign, you know, and temperamental. They say she was screaming fit to wake the dead last night, carrying on about persecution and Gestapo, and I don't know what else. And she had the perfect opportunity, didn't she? Right there in the house, knowing where everything was." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound. She was reading the morning's Chipping Cleghorn Gazette, which had managed to report the incident with remarkable speed, though the details were somewhat garbled. The headline read, "Shooting at Little Paddocks, Pearls Stolen." "Mind you," Cherry continued, warming to her subject, "Mrs. Butt says it could just as easily be those young people, Patrick and Julia. Living off Miss Blacklock's charity. They are, and everyone knows she's got money. Maybe they got tired of waiting for their inheritance." "Patrick and Julia are related to Miss Blacklock?" Miss Marple inquired, though she knew the answer. "Second cousins or some such?" Their mother was Miss Blacklock's cousin, but she died years ago, and the father ran off. Miss Blacklock took them in out of the kindness of her heart. That's what Mrs. Finch at the post office says anyway. Very Christian of her, though I'm not sure they're properly grateful. Miss Marple set down the newspaper. I think I shall pay a call on Miss Blacklock this morning. One ought to inquire after her health. She found little Paddocks in a state of subdued disorder. Inspector Craddock's men had evidently been thorough in their search, and while everything had been put back, there remained an air of disturbance, as though the house itself were unsettled. Bunny Bunner answered the door, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Letty is in the sitting room. The inspector has just finished questioning her again. It's been such a dreadful ordeal." Letitia Blacklock sat by the window, a white bandage now decorating her ear. She looked older in the morning light, the lines around her mouth and eyes more pronounced. But her voice, when she greeted Miss Marple, was firm. "Good of you to come, Miss Marple. I hope you'll forgive the chaos. The police have been very thorough, though I'm not sure what they expect to find." "They've made an arrest, I understand," Miss Marple said gently, settling into a chair. "Mitzi." Miss Blacklock sighed heavily. "Though I can't bring myself to believe it. The poor woman is terrified. She keeps insisting that she's being persecuted, that she'll be sent back to Europe. Inspector Craddock found her in the kitchen this morning, packing a bag. She was trying to run away." "That does look suspicious," Miss Marple observed. "Or frightened. She's had a difficult life, Miss Marple. Lost her entire family in the war. She came to England with nothing, and she's always been nervous about deportation. I think when the shooting happened, she panicked. In her mind, she'd be blamed simply for being foreign. And yet she had the best opportunity," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "She knew the house, knew where the fuse box was located. She could have staged the whole thing and returned to the kitchen before anyone was the wiser. But why?" Letitia Blacklock spread her hands. "What possible motive could she have? I pay her fairly. I've never mistreated her. And the pearls, Julia's pearls. Mitzi wouldn't even have known where Julia kept her jewellery." This was a point Miss Marple had considered herself. "Tell me about the pearls, Miss Blacklock. Were they very valuable?" "Moderately so. They belonged to my aunt, Julia's and Patrick's grandmother. I inherited various pieces of jewellery when she died, and I gave the pearls to Julia on her 21st birthday. She was fond of them, but they weren't worth more than a few £100, hardly worth committing murder for." "Unless," Miss Marple suggested delicately, "the murder was the point, and the pearls merely an afterthought. A way to muddy the waters, so to speak." Letitia Blacklock's face paled. "You think someone was genuinely trying to kill me?" "The bullet that grazed your ear suggests as much, my dear." There was a long silence. Finally, Miss Blacklock spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "But who would want me dead? I'm not a particularly important person. I have some money, yes, but nothing extraordinary. I've made no enemies that I'm aware of." "Tell me about your will," Miss Marple said gently. Miss Blacklock looked startled, then resigned. "I suppose the inspector asked the same thing. I've left the bulk of my estate divided between Patrick and Julia. They're my closest living relatives. There's a bequest for Bunny, of course, and smaller amounts for Mrs. Harmon, who comes in to clean, and for Mitzi. But Patrick and Julia inherit the house and the majority of my investments." "And how much would that be, if you don't mind my asking?" "Approximately £30,000, perhaps a bit more. My late employer, Mr. Godler, was very generous to me over the years. I managed his financial affairs and helped his wife Belle run their household. When he died, he left me a comfortable sum, and I've invested it wisely. £30,000. Miss Marple considered this. A substantial amount, certainly enough to kill for, if one were so inclined. Patrick appeared in the doorway, his usually cheerful expression subdued. "Aunt Letty, Julia's asking for you. She's still upset about the pearls." "Of course." Miss Blacklock rose wearily. "Will you excuse me, Miss Marple?" After she left, Patrick remained, studying Miss Marple with curious eyes. "You're the detective lady, aren't you? The one who solved that business with the vicar's wife?" "I hardly think detective is the appropriate term," Miss Marple demurred. "I simply take an interest in people." "Well, you seem to be taking a considerable interest in this business. Do you think Mitzi did it?" Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "What do you think, Mr. Simmons?" He laughed, but there was no humour in it. "I think it's convenient that the foreign refugee gets blamed. I also think that Inspector Craddock isn't entirely convinced, no matter what the newspapers say. He keeps asking questions about where everyone was, what everyone could see. He's particularly interested in Julia and me." "Because you stand to inherit?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "It's always the relatives, isn't it? In books and films, it's always the greedy heir. But Julia and I didn't even know Aunt Letty was well off until a few months ago. We came here because we had nowhere else to go, not because we were plotting murder." "Yet someone placed that advertisement in the newspaper," Miss Marple said quietly. "Someone wanted an audience for this crime. That suggests a certain theatrical bent. Perhaps someone who reads detective stories or enjoys drama." Patrick's eyes widened slightly. "Julia's an actress, or trying to be. That's what you're suggesting, isn't it? That this was all staged and my sister is behind it?" "I'm suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I'm simply observing that this crime has many curious features. The advertisement, the precise timing, the theatrical manner of the shooting, the convenient theft of the pearls. It all seems rather orchestrated." Patrick stared at her for a long moment, then turned and left without another word. Miss Marple sat alone in the sitting room, her mind working methodically through the facts. Someone in this house, she was certain, was a very clever murderer indeed. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue Miss. Marple took her leave of little Paddocks and walked slowly through the village, nodding pleasantly to various acquaintances, while her mind remained wholly occupied with the puzzle at hand. She was reminded forcibly of a case in her youth involving a woman named Eliza Clipp, who had staged an elaborate burglary, complete with broken windows and ransacked rooms, only to be undone by a single inconsistency. She had claimed the thieves broke in through a window that had been painted shut for years. There was something like that here. Some small detail that didn't quite fit. Miss Marple could feel it nagging at the edges of her consciousness, but it remained frustratingly elusive. She encountered Inspector Craddock outside the post office. He looked tired, she thought, and rather harried. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with evident relief. "I wonder if I might have a word. I understand you were among the first on the scene last evening." "I was in my garden when I heard the shot," Miss Marple confirmed, "though I didn't enter the house until several minutes later." "But you've lived in St. Mary Mead for many years. You know these people." He hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "I'm not entirely satisfied with Mitzi as a suspect. Her behaviour is certainly suspicious. The attempt to flee, the hysterics. But something doesn't sit right. A woman in her position trying to commit murder in a house full of witnesses. It seems reckless to the point of stupidity." "Unless she's very clever," Miss Marple suggested, "and is counting on everyone thinking exactly that." "Perhaps." He didn't sound convinced. "But there's another matter. I've been checking Miss Blacklock's background, as one does in these cases. Her story is perfectly legitimate. She worked for years as a secretary and financial advisor to a wealthy man named Randall Godler. He died about 10 years ago, leaving her a comfortable inheritance. Everything appears straightforward, but, Miss Marple prompted gently, but I've discovered something odd. Randall Godler had a wife, Belle Godler, who was an invalid. She died several years after her husband in a nursing home in Scotland. The interesting thing is that Belle Godler made a new will shortly before her death, leaving a considerable sum, nearly £60,000, to my dear friend Letitia Blacklock. However, Miss Blacklock never received this inheritance. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Why not? Because there was a condition. Belle Godler's will specified that Letitia Blacklock would inherit only if she survived another person, a Mrs. Pippa Stamfordis, who was Belle Godler's younger sister. If Pippa died first, Letitia would inherit. But if Letitia died first, everything would go to Pippa. And where is Mrs. Stamfordis now? That's just it, I don't know. She seems to have disappeared. The solicitors handling the estate have been trying to locate her for several years. The last known address was in Switzerland, but she left there in 1945 and hasn't been heard from since. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. So if Miss Blacklock were to die now, before Mrs. Stamfordis is found, the inheritance would remain in limbo. But here's the interesting part. If Mrs. Stamfordis were already dead, if she died years ago, for instance, and no one knew, then Miss Blacklock would have inherited that £60,000 the moment Belle Godler died. It would have been hers all along, legally speaking. But she couldn't claim it without proof of Mrs. Stamfordis's death, Miss Marple said slowly. So the money simply sits there waiting. Exactly. £60,000, Miss Marple, in addition to the £30,000 she already has. That's quite a fortune, and quite a motive for murder, if someone stands to inherit from her. They walked together in silence for a moment. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. Inspector, may I ask you something? When you examined the sitting room last night, did you find the bullets? One of them. It had lodged in the wall behind where Miss Blacklock had been standing. We haven't found the second one yet, though we've searched thoroughly. And the revolver? Surely it must have been left behind or found nearby. Craddock's expression grew grim. That's another curious point. No weapon was found. Whoever fired those shots took the gun with them, even though they were supposedly fleeing in panic. Even though... Miss Marple paused at the corner where their paths would diverge. Inspector, I wonder if you've considered that the placement of that advertisement might tell us something important. Why announce the murder in advance? It seems to serve no purpose except to gather witnesses. Unless the murderer needed witnesses, Craddock said thoughtfully. Needed people to see, or rather, not see something specific. Precisely. And there's another small thing that's been troubling me. Everyone describes hearing the voice say, "Stick 'em up." But has anyone remarked how peculiar that is? We're in an English village in 1952, not a Chicago speakeasy. It's such an artificial theatrical choice of words. As though someone were playing a role, Craddock agreed. Someone who wanted to sound like a criminal from an American film. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. The inspector, she thought, was quite intelligent. There's one more thing. Miss Bunner mentioned that Miss Blacklock worked in a financial capacity for Mr. Godler. I wonder, did her position give her knowledge of other people's financial affairs? Might she know something about someone in St. Mary Mead that could be uncomfortable? Blackmail, you mean? Not necessarily blackmail. Simply knowledge. Sometimes knowing another person's secrets can be dangerous, even if one has no intention of using that knowledge. Inspector Craddock made a note in his little book. I'll make inquiries. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've been most helpful. After he left, Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind still worrying at the problem. She found herself outside the vicarage, and on impulse, she went in search of Mrs. Dane Calthrop. The vicar's wife was in the garden, attacking the weeds with characteristic vigour. "Jane, have you come to tell me who did it? Everyone's saying it's that poor Swiss woman, but I don't believe it for a moment." "I'm not certain yet," Miss Marple admitted, "but I'm troubled by something, and I can't quite put my finger on it." "That usually means it's something small," Mrs. Dane Calthrop observed. "Something everyone saw but nobody noticed." "Yes," Miss Marple said slowly. "Yes, that's exactly it. Something we all saw." And then, quite suddenly, she had it. The detail that had been nagging at her consciousness crystallized into clarity. She thought of Letitia Blacklock sitting in her chair this morning, the morning sunlight falling across her face. She thought of the previous evening, the confusion and darkness and fear. And she thought of pearls. "I must go," she said abruptly. "Thank you, my dear. You've helped me more than you know." As she hurried home, her mind was already racing ahead, fitting pieces together. She wasn't ready to voice her suspicions yet. There were still gaps in her understanding. But she knew now what she was looking for. And she knew, with a cold certainty that made her quicken her pace, that the danger was far from over. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue Miss. Marple took her leave of little Paddocks and walked slowly through the village, nodding pleasantly to various acquaintances, while her mind remained wholly occupied with the puzzle at hand. She was reminded forcibly of a case in her youth involving a woman named Eliza Clipp, who had staged an elaborate burglary, complete with broken windows and ransacked rooms, only to be undone by a single inconsistency. She had claimed the thieves broke in through a window that had been painted shut for years. There was something like that here. Some small detail that didn't quite fit. Miss Marple could feel it nagging at the edges of her consciousness, but it remained frustratingly elusive. She encountered Inspector Craddock outside the post office. He looked tired, she thought, and rather harried. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with evident relief. "I wonder if I might have a word. I understand you were among the first on the scene last evening." "I was in my garden when I heard the shot," Miss Marple confirmed, "though I didn't enter the house until several minutes later." "But you've lived in St. Mary Mead for many years. You know these people." He hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "I'm not entirely satisfied with Mitzi as a suspect. Her behavior is certainly suspicious. The attempt to flee, the hysterics. But something doesn't sit right. A woman in her position trying to commit murder in a house full of witnesses. It seems reckless to the point of stupidity." "Unless she's very clever," Miss Marple suggested, "and is counting on everyone thinking exactly that." "Perhaps." He didn't sound convinced. "But there's another matter. I've been checking Miss Blacklock's background, as one does in these cases. Her story is perfectly legitimate. She worked for years as a secretary and financial advisor to a wealthy man named Randall Godler. He died about 10 years ago, leaving her a comfortable inheritance. Everything appears straightforward, but," Miss Marple prompted gently, "but I've discovered something odd. Randall Godler had a wife, Belle Godler, who was an invalid. She died several years after her husband, in a nursing home in Scotland. The interesting thing is that Belle Godler made a new will shortly before her death, leaving a considerable sum, nearly £60,000, to my dear friend Letitia Blacklock. However, Miss Blacklock never received this inheritance." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Why not?" "Because there was a condition. Belle Godler's will specified that Letitia Blacklock would inherit only if she survived another person. A Mrs. Pippa Stamfordis, who was Belgodler's younger sister. If Pippa died first, Letitia would inherit. But if Letitia died first, everything would go to Pippa. And where is Mrs. Stamfordis now? That's just it, I don't know. She seems to have disappeared. The solicitors handling the estate have been trying to locate her for several years. The last known address was in Switzerland, but she left there in 1945 and hasn't been heard from since. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. So if Miss Blacklock were to die now, before Mrs. Stamfordis is found, the inheritance would remain in limbo. But here's the interesting part. If Mrs. Stamfordis were already dead, if she died years ago, for instance, and no one knew, then Miss Blacklock would have inherited that £60,000 the moment Belgodler died. It would have been hers all along, legally speaking. But she couldn't claim it without proof of Mrs. Stamfordis's death, Miss Marple said slowly. So the money simply sits there waiting. Exactly. £60,000, Miss Marple, in addition to the £30,000 she already has. That's quite a fortune, and quite a motive for murder, if someone stands to inherit from her. They walked together in silence for a moment. Finally, Miss Marple spoke. Inspector, may I ask you something? When you examined the sitting room last night, did you find the bullets? One of them. It had lodged in the wall behind where Miss Blacklock had been standing. We haven't found the second one yet, though we've searched thoroughly. And the revolver? Surely it must have been left behind or found nearby. Craddock's expression grew grim. That's another curious point. No weapon was found. Whoever fired those shots took the gun with them, even though they were supposedly fleeing in panic. Even though. Miss Marple paused at the corner where their paths would diverge. Inspector, I wonder if you've considered that the placement of that advertisement might tell us something important. Why announce the murder in advance? It seems to serve no purpose except to gather witnesses. Unless the murderer needed witnesses, Craddock said thoughtfully. Needed people to see, or rather, not see something specific. Precisely. And there's another small thing that's been troubling me. Everyone describes hearing the voice say, "Stick 'em up." But has anyone remarked how peculiar that is? We're in an English village in 1952, not a Chicago speakeasy. It's such an artificial theatrical choice of words. As though someone were playing a role, Craddock agreed. Someone who wanted to sound like a criminal from an American film. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. The inspector, she thought, was quite intelligent. There's one more thing. Miss Bunner mentioned that Miss Blacklock worked in a financial capacity for Mr. Godler. I wonder, did her position give her knowledge of other people's financial affairs? Might she know something about someone in St. Mary Mead that could be uncomfortable? Blackmail, you mean? Not necessarily blackmail. Simply knowledge. Sometimes knowing another person's secrets can be dangerous, even if one has no intention of using that knowledge. Inspector Craddock made a note in his little book. I'll make inquiries. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've been most helpful. After he left, Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind still worrying at the problem. She found herself outside the vicarage, and on impulse, she went in search of Mrs. Dane Calthrop. The vicar's wife was in the garden, attacking the weeds with characteristic vigour. Jane, have you come to tell me who did it? Everyone's saying it's that poor Swiss woman, but I don't believe it for a moment. I'm not certain yet, Miss Marple admitted, but I'm troubled by something, and I can't quite put my finger on it. That usually means it's something small, Mrs. Dane Calthrop observed. Something everyone saw but nobody noticed. Yes, Miss Marple said slowly. Yes, that's exactly it. Something we all saw. And then, quite suddenly, she had it. The detail that had been nagging at her consciousness crystallized into clarity. She thought of Letitia Blacklock sitting in her chair this morning, the morning sunlight falling across her face. She thought of the previous evening, the confusion and darkness and fear, and she thought of pearls. "I must go," she said abruptly. "Thank you, my dear. You've helped me more than you know." As she hurried home, her mind was already racing ahead, fitting pieces together. She wasn't ready to voice her suspicions yet. There were still gaps in her understanding, but she knew now what she was looking for. And she knew, with a cold certainty that made her quicken her pace, that the danger was far from over. Chapter 7. Another twist Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, looking as though he'd had little sleep. He accepted her offer of coffee gratefully and settled into the chintz armchair with a weary sigh. "I've spent half the night going through records," he began without preamble. "Pippa Stamfordis, Belle Godler's sister, has been remarkably difficult to trace, but I've finally found something. She married a man named Stamfordis in 1930, a Greek businessman. They lived in Switzerland for several years, then moved to Scotland just before the war. Her husband died in 1943, and after that, the trail goes cold. No death certificate." Miss Marple asked. "None that I can find. But here's where it becomes interesting. I contacted the nursing home where Belle Godler spent her final years. One of the nurses who attended her is still alive, now retired. I spoke with her last night by telephone." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She remembers Belle Godler very well. Said she was a lovely woman, very gentle, very confused toward the end. But she also remembers Belle receiving regular visits from her sister Pippa." Miss Marple set down her coffee cup. "When was this?" "Right up until a few months before Belle died. The nurse described Pippa as a small woman, dark-haired, very elegant. She always wore beautiful jewelry, particularly pearls, 3 strands of them." The significance of this was not lost on Miss Marple. 3 strands, like the necklace that Julia claims was stolen. Exactly. Now, Belle Godler died in 1949. If Pippa was visiting her regularly until shortly before her death, then Pippa was certainly alive in 1949. But since then, nothing. No trace of her anywhere. Could she have died shortly after her sister? It's possible, but without a death certificate, Letitia Blacklock cannot claim the inheritance. The money sits in trust, waiting. Craddock leaned forward intently. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking about what you said, about Miss Blacklock's position with the Godler family. What if she knew something about Pippa? Something that made Pippa dangerous to her?" Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Dane Calthrop running down the lane, her hat askew, calling out urgently. Miss Marple opened the door at once. "Whatever is the matter?" "It's Bunny, Dora Bunner," Mrs. Dane Calthrop gasped, out of breath. "She's been taken terribly ill. Dr. Haydock is with her now at Little Paddocks. They think, oh, it's dreadful, they think she's been poisoned." Inspector Craddock was on his feet instantly. "Poisoned? When?" "This morning. She took her tea up to her room as usual. Said she wasn't feeling well and wanted to rest. An hour later, Miss Blacklock heard her crying out. By the time they reached her, she was in convulsions. They hurried to Little Paddocks, where they found Dr. Haydock descending the stairs, his face grave. Miss Blacklock stood in the hallway, clutching Patrick's arm, her face ashen. "How is she?" Craddock demanded. "I've given her something to counteract the poison. Atropine, I believe, based on the symptoms. She may survive, but it's touch and go." Haydock's expression was grim. "She's asking for Miss Blacklock. Keeps saying she has to tell her something important." They mounted the stairs to Bunny's small bedroom. The elderly woman lay propped on pillows, Her face flushed and her breathing laboured. When she saw Miss Blacklock, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Letty," she whispered. "Oh, Letty, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought it was just aspirin." "Hush, dear," Miss Blacklock soothed, taking her hand. "Don't try to talk." "But I must. The cocoa. It was in the cocoa. I made it for both of us, just like always. But then I had that biscuit, the one on the tray. It tasted odd, bitter, but I was hungry." She broke off, coughing. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the doorway, spoke gently. "Miss Bunner, where did the biscuit come from?" "The tin in the kitchen. The special ones Letty likes. I took one before bringing up the cocoa." Her grip tightened on Miss Blacklock's hand. "Don't you see? It was meant for you, Letty. The poison was meant for you." The room fell silent. Miss Blacklock's face had gone white as paper. Who had access to the kitchen this morning? Inspector Craddock asked sharply. "Everyone," Patrick said from the doorway. "We all have breakfast there. Mitzi, Julia, myself, Aunt Letty. Even Bunny was in and out." "The biscuit tin," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Was it a tin that Miss Blacklock uses regularly?" "Yes," Miss Blacklock confirmed, her voice shaking. "I have a weakness for those particular almond biscuits. Everyone knows I eat them with my afternoon tea." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "I need to take Miss Bunner to the hospital in Melchester. She needs proper care, and I want the poison analysed properly. Inspector, I suggest you secure that biscuit tin immediately." After the ambulance had departed with poor Bunny, Craddock gathered everyone in the sitting room. Mitzi had been summoned from the kitchen and stood wringing her apron nervously. Julia sat beside Patrick on the sofa, her face pale. Miss Blacklock occupied her usual chair, looking suddenly old and frail. "This changes everything," Craddock said quietly. "We're no longer dealing with a failed attempt. Someone has tried twice now to murder Miss Blacklock, and they very nearly succeeded in killing Miss Bunner instead." "But who?" Julia cried. "Who would do such a thing?" Craddock's gaze swept the room. "That's what we need to determine, and quickly before they make a third attempt." Miss Marple studied each face carefully. Patrick, his usual insouciance replaced by genuine concern. Julia, frightened and defensive. Mitzi, terrified and incomprehensible in her mixture of German and English. And Miss Blacklock herself, composed on the surface, but with fear lurking in her eyes. Someone in this house, Miss Marple thought, was a consummate actor. Someone who could sit among friends and family while calmly planning murder. Someone who had already demonstrated they were willing to sacrifice innocent people. Bunny Bunner, who had accidentally eaten the poisoned biscuit meant for someone else. The first attempt had been theatrical, designed for an audience, but this second attempt was intimate, domestic, and infinitely more dangerous. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think we need to look much more carefully at the past, at connections and relationships that might not be obvious, at who people really are beneath the faces they show the world." Craddock nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to think you're right, Miss Marple. Nothing in this case is quite what it seems." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes troubled. "Nothing at all." And in her mind, pieces were beginning to shift and realign, forming a pattern that was both surprising and horrible in its implications. But she needed more information. One crucial piece was still missing, and she thought she knew where to find it. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test that evening. Miss Marple sat in her cottage with a small collection of items spread before her on the table. The newspaper containing the original advertisement, notes she had made about each person's movements during the shooting, and a photograph she had borrowed from the vicarage archives. A group photo taken at a church fete 18 months ago, shortly after Miss Blacklock had arrived in St. Mary Mead. She studied the photograph carefully, using her magnifying glass to examine each face. There was Miss Blacklock, standing somewhat stiffly beside Bunny Bunner. Patrick and Julia were there as well, laughing at something off camera. And there, in the background, partially obscured by other figures, was someone else. Someone whose face Miss Marple examined with particular interest. The telephone rang, startling her from her reverie. It was Inspector Craddock. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd want to know. Miss Bunner is holding her own. Dr. Haydock thinks she'll survive, though it was a near thing. The poison was atropine derived from deadly nightshade. Enough to kill, but Miss Bunner's constitution is stronger than it appears." "Thank goodness," Miss Marple said sincerely. "Has she been able to tell you anything more?" "Nothing useful, I'm afraid. She keeps insisting the poison was meant for Miss Blacklock, but she can't tell us who might have placed it in the biscuit tin. Anyone could have done it. The kitchen is constantly in use." "Inspector, I wonder if you've had a chance to follow up on that matter we discussed, about Pippa Stamfordis." "Actually, yes. I've obtained a photograph of her taken in 1948 at her sister Belle's nursing home. I'm having it sent over from Scotland. Should arrive tomorrow morning. I thought perhaps Miss Blacklock might be able to confirm the identification." "That would be most helpful," Miss Marple said carefully. "Most helpful indeed." After ringing off, she sat in thought for a long while. Then, with the decisiveness of someone who had reached a conclusion, she put on her coat and hat and walked through the dusk to Little Paddock's. She found Miss Blacklock alone in the sitting room, staring into the fire. The house felt emptier without Bunny's anxious presence. "Miss Marple," Letitia Blacklock said, rousing herself. "Forgive me, I wasn't expecting visitors. I hope you don't mind my calling. I wanted to see how you were managing." "As well as can be expected, I suppose. Poor Bunny. To think that poison was meant for me, and she suffered instead. I feel responsible." Miss Marple settled herself in a chair. "You mustn't blame yourself, my dear. The responsibility lies entirely with whoever prepared that poisoned biscuit." She paused delicately. "Tell me, Miss Blacklock, have you given any thought to who might have done such a thing?" "I've thought of nothing else, but I can't make sense of it. Patrick and Julia would inherit if I died. Yes, but they could simply wait. I'm not a young woman. Why take such desperate measures now?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "because they can't afford to wait. Or perhaps because the motive isn't quite what it seems." Miss Blacklock looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about that £60,000. The money Belgodler left you, contingent on Pippa Stamfordis's death. It's a considerable sum, is it not? Large enough to be worth killing for. But I don't have that money. I can't claim it until—" She stopped abruptly. "Until Pippa's death is proven," Miss Marple finished. "Yes, quite. But suppose someone believed you already had received it. Suppose someone thought you were concealing wealth you had no legal right to." Miss Blacklock's face was unreadable. "That would be a misunderstanding, would it?" Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "You see, I've been wondering about something. You've lived quite comfortably here at Little Paddock's. More comfortably, perhaps, than £30,000 would easily support. You employ servants, maintain a large house, support 2 young relatives. That suggests either very wise investments or additional income from somewhere." "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" "Not accusing, merely observing. I observe, for instance, that you wear very little jewellery. No rings, no bracelets, no necklaces. Yet you gave Julia a valuable pearl necklace that supposedly belonged to your aunt. Where did those pearls come from, Miss Blacklock?" The silence stretched between them. Finally, Miss Blacklock spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "I don't see what my jewellery has to do with someone trying to murder me." "Don't you?" Miss Marple leaned forward. "I think pearls have everything to do with this case. 3 strands of pearls, to be precise. The same 3 strands that Pippa Stamfordis was known to wear when she visited her sister Belle. Miss Blacklock's face had gone very pale. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing yet. I'm simply noting curious coincidences. I'm noting, for instance, that no one in St. Mary Mead knew you before you arrived 18 months ago. I'm noting that you took in 2 young relatives whom you'd never met before. I'm noting that you seem to have expected this inheritance from Belle Goodler. Expected it quite confidently, in fact." "What are you implying?" Miss Marple met her eyes steadily. "I'm implying that someone in this house is not who they claim to be, and I believe that person is the key to everything that's happened." A sound from the doorway made them both turn. Julia stood there, her face white, her hands clenched at her sides. "You know, don't you?" Julia whispered. "You figured it out." Miss Marple said nothing, simply waited. Julia walked slowly into the room, her movements mechanical. "I wanted to tell someone. The weight of it, the constant pretending, it's been unbearable." She looked at Miss Blacklock with something like desperation. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Julia, be quiet." Miss Blacklock's voice was sharp, but Julia shook her head. "No, no more lies. No more pretending." She turned to Miss Marple. "You're right about the pearls, and you're right that someone here isn't who they claim to be. But it's not. The lights went out." In the sudden darkness, Miss Marple heard a sharp intake of breath, then the sound of a scuffle. Something crashed to the floor. She remained perfectly still, her hand reaching for the heavy brass candlestick on the table beside her. "Don't move!" a voice commanded, not rough this time, but cultured and familiar. "Any of you." And then the lights came back on, and Miss Marple found herself looking at a sight that confirmed her worst suspicions. Patrick stood by the light switch, a revolver in his hand, but he wasn't pointing it at Miss Marple or at Julia. He was pointing it directly at Miss Blacklock. "Now," he said softly, his pleasant face transformed by something cold and determined. "Now we're going to have the truth. All of it." Chapter 9. The Reveal. "Patrick, what are you doing?" Julia's voice was shrill with panic. "Put that gun down. Stay where you are, Julia." Patrick's tone was calm, almost conversational, but the gun never wavered. "I think it's time we all stopped pretending. Don't you agree, Aunt Letty? Or should I say, Pippa?" The name fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Miss Blacklock, or whoever she was, remained motionless in her chair, her face an expressionless mask. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "You knew." "Not at first," Patrick admitted, his eyes still fixed on the woman in the chair. "But gradually things didn't add up. Little inconsistencies. She'd claim not to know something about the Goodler family, then accidentally reveal knowledge she shouldn't have had. She'd refer to places in Switzerland with too much familiarity for someone who'd supposedly never been there. And then there were the pearls." "The pearls Julia was given," Miss Marple said. "The 3-strand necklace that supposedly belonged to our grandmother. Only when I looked up our family history properly, I discovered our grandmother never owned such pearls. She was a farmer's wife in Yorkshire. She wouldn't have known what to do with pearls like that." Patrick's voice hardened. "But Pippa Stamfordis owned pearls exactly like those. It's mentioned in several society columns from before the war." Miss Blacklock, Pippa, finally spoke, her voice weary. "You're very clever, Patrick, but you don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it to us," Patrick said, "starting with where the real Letitia Blacklock is." A long moment passed. Then the woman in the chair seemed to deflate, all pretense draining away. When she spoke again, her voice was different, softer, with a trace of an accent that hadn't been there before. "Letty died," she said simply. 3 years ago in Switzerland. We were together when it happened, a stroke, sudden and massive. One moment she was speaking, the next she was gone. "And you saw an opportunity," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "You must understand, I was desperate. My husband had died, leaving me with nothing. The war had destroyed what little money I had. I was living in a single room in Lausanne, trying to survive on nothing." Her hands twisted in her lap. Letty and I had been friends since childhood. We looked somewhat alike, the same height, similar colouring, though she was older. And she'd told me about Belle's will, about the inheritance that would come to her when I died. "So you took her identity," Patrick said flatly. "I took her life, the one she would have had. We were in Switzerland together, far from anyone who knew either of us well. I had her papers, her letters, her passport. It wasn't difficult to become Letitia Blacklock. And as Letitia Blacklock, I could return to England, claim her estate, live comfortably. All I had to do was wait for my own death to be recorded, Pippa's death, and then I would inherit from Belle as well." "But Pippa couldn't die," Miss Marple observed. "Because you were Pippa. Exactly. So I've been in limbo, unable to claim the full inheritance, but living on what Letty had saved. It's been enough, but barely." She looked up at Patrick, her eyes filled with something like pleading. "I never meant any harm. I've been kind to you and Julia, haven't I? Given you a home when you had nowhere else to go, and nearly gotten us both suspected of murder," Julia said bitterly. "That advertisement, that shooting, you did it all, didn't you? To fake your own death and claim the inheritance." But Miss Marple was shaking her head. "No, that's not what happened at all." Everyone turned to look at her. "You see," Miss Marple continued gently, "Pippa, the woman we know as Miss Blacklock, couldn't have staged that shooting herself. She was the intended victim. Someone discovered her deception and decided to eliminate her before she could claim the £60,000. "But who?" Julia demanded. "Someone who stood to inherit if Letitia Blacklock died," Miss Marple said. "Someone who believed they were related to Letitia and would therefore inherit her estate. Someone who didn't realize that the woman they were trying to kill wasn't actually Letitia at all." Patrick lowered the gun slightly, his face uncertain. "You're saying Julia and I are not the murderers," Miss Marple finished, "though I believe the murderer hoped suspicion would fall on you. The theatricality of the first attempt, the stolen pearls, all designed to muddy the waters and create multiple suspects." "Then who?" Patrick demanded. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window, looking out into the darkness. "The murderer," she said slowly, "is someone who knew the real Letitia Blacklock. Someone who would have recognized that our Miss Blacklock was an imposter if they had ever actually met the real Letitia. But they hadn't. They only knew of her, knew she existed and had money. They came to St. Mary Mead, believing they had found her, never suspecting they'd found Pippa instead." She turned back to face the room. "The murderer placed that advertisement to gather witnesses, not to show that the attack was a joke, but to establish that there had been an attack at all. They wanted everyone to see Miss Blacklock nearly killed, so that when the second attempt succeeded, no one would question that she'd been the intended victim all along." "But who?" Julia asked again, her voice barely a whisper. Miss Marple's eyes were sad but certain. "Someone who has been in this house from the beginning. Someone who had access to the kitchen, who knew Miss Blacklock's habits, who could turn off the lights and stage the shooting without arousing suspicion. Someone who..." The door burst open. Inspector Craddock stood there, his face flushed from running, several constables behind him. "Miss Marple, thank God. I got your note." He stopped, taking in the scene. Patrick with the gun, the three women frozen in tableau. "What's happened here?" "Inspector," Miss Marple said calmly, "I believe you should arrest—" A sound from the hallway interrupted her. Bunny Bunner stood there in her nightgown, having apparently been released from the hospital. But there was something wrong with her appearance, something off about the way she held herself. "No," she said, her voice completely different from her usual fluttering tone. "No, I don't think anyone will be arresting anyone just yet." And in her hand, she held a revolver. The same revolver, Miss Marple realized with a chill, that had been used in the first shooting. "You see," Bunny continued, her face transforming from foolish confusion to cold calculation, "I'm afraid dear Miss Marple has figured it all out, and that means we've come to the end of our little drama." Chapter 10. The truth revealed the transformation in Bunny Bunner was so complete that for a moment no one moved. The silly, fluttering mannerisms had vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating intelligence that was jarring in its contrast. "You're not Dora Bunner," Miss Marple said quietly. "You never were." "Very good, Miss Marple." The woman's voice was crisp, educated, nothing like Bunny's anxious twitter, though I played the part rather well, didn't I? Poor, foolish, devoted Bunny, grateful for every crumb of kindness, dependent on dear Letty for everything. No one looks twice at someone like that. No one suspects them of anything. Inspector Craddock had his hand on his own weapon, but the woman shook her head sharply. "I wouldn't, Inspector. I've already shot at people once. I'm quite prepared to do it again, and at this range I won't miss." "Who are you?" "Pippa, the false Letitia Blacklock," whispered, her face ashen. "Don't you know? Think back, Pippa. Think back to your sister Belle's nursing home. You visited her often in those last months, didn't you? Wearing your beautiful pearls, talking about the old days." Belle's mind was failing, but there was one nurse who sat with her for hours, who heard all those rambling stories about the past. A nurse named Emma Stamfordis. Pippa's hand flew to her mouth. "George's daughter. But you were just a child when my father died." "Yes, I was 12, old enough to understand that he'd left us penniless, that everything he'd promised my mother was a lie. We'd lived well while he was alive. He was your husband, after all, even if you barely acknowledged us. The mistress and the illegitimate daughter, tucked away in our little flat in Edinburgh, visited once a month if we were lucky." The bitterness in her voice was corrosive. "After he died, we had nothing. My mother worked as a seamstress until her health failed. I became a nurse, a good one actually, and then, by sheer chance, I was assigned to care for Belle Godler. Imagine my surprise when this confused old woman started talking about her sister Pippa, and Pippa's husband George Stamfordis. "My father, I didn't know," Pippa said weakly. "George never told me. Of course he didn't. Why would he? We were an inconvenience, easily forgotten." Emma's face twisted. "But Belle told me everything. About the will, about the money left to Letitia Blacklock, contingent on your death. £60,000, a fortune. And I thought, why should Letitia Blacklock inherit? She was just an employee, a secretary. She wasn't family. But I was. I was George Stamfordis's daughter, even if he never acknowledged me." Miss Marple spoke softly. "So you researched Letitia Blacklock? Found out where she'd gone after Belle died. You discovered she'd moved to St. Mary Mead, set herself up as a respectable woman of means, and you decided to join her household, but not as yourself." "The real Dora Bunner was perfect," Emma said. "An old school friend of Letitia's who'd fallen on hard times. That's what the letters said. Letters I found among Belle's things describing poor Bunny's reduced circumstances. It wasn't difficult to track down the real Bunny. She was living in a boarding house in Bournemouth, surviving on a tiny pension. Julia gasped. What did you do to her? Nothing violent, if that's what you're imagining. I simply suggested she take a trip abroad. Portugal, I believe. I gave her money, more than she'd seen in years. Told her it was from an inheritance that had come through, and that I was a solicitor's clerk. She went gladly, poor thing. She may still be there, enjoying the sunshine, completely unaware that someone has been impersonating her. And you arrived here claiming to be Bunny Bunner, Inspector Craddock said, his voice hard. Letitia Blacklock accepted you because she believed you were her old friend. She was so grateful to have Bunny back in her life, so touched by the reunion. She never questioned it. Why would she? I had all of Bunny's letters, knew all the old stories from their school days. I was perfect, Pippa was shaking her head. But you poisoned me. You poisoned your own biscuit, did I? Emma smiled coldly. Or did I poison yours, knowing you'd offer me one as you always did? Knowing I could eat just enough to make myself ill, but not enough to die? It was rather brilliant, actually. Everyone assumed the poison was meant for you. But I'd taken an antidote beforehand. Just enough atropine to cause symptoms, but I'd built up a tolerance. Dr. Haydock never suspected. Miss Marple's voice was steady despite the gun pointed in their direction. But the first attempt, the shooting, that was real. You truly tried to kill her then? Of course. I'd planned it so carefully. The advertisement to gather witnesses, to make it seem like a game. The darkness, the disguise. I stood in that doorway and fired at her, 2 shots that should have killed her. But my hand shook at the last moment, or she moved, I don't know. The bullet only grazed her ear. And the pearls? Patrick asked, his own gun now hanging uselessly at his side. Oh, those! Emma laughed, a sound devoid of humour. I took them to confuse matters, to make it look like a robbery. They're hidden in the garden, buried under the roses. Ironic, isn't it? My father should have given my mother pearls like those. Should have acknowledged us, provided for us. Instead, I stole them from the woman who was pretending to be someone she wasn't. We're both pretenders then, Pippa said quietly. Both living lies. Yes, but you see, your lie was going to make you rich. Mine was going to make me a murderer. Emma's face was bleak. I told myself it was justice, that you were a fraud, stealing an inheritance that should have gone to the real Letitia Blacklock's family. That by killing you, I was somehow righting a wrong. But the truth is simpler, isn't it, Miss Marple? You wanted the money, Miss Marple said gently. You believed that if Pippa died, the inheritance would revert to the Stamfordis family, to you, as George's daughter. I consulted a solicitor in London, secretly, of course, told him a hypothetical case. He said that if Pippa Stamfordis died without heirs, and if a legitimate claim could be made by another family member, there might be grounds for contesting the will. It was a slim chance, but it was something. More than I'd ever had before. Inspector Craddock took a careful step forward. Miss Stamfordis, this can't end well. Put down the gun. Let us help you. Help me? Emma's laugh was brittle. I'm a murderer, Inspector, or tried to be twice. There's no help for that. Her hand trembled slightly, the gun wavering. I keep thinking about my mother, working her fingers to the bone while my father's legitimate wife lived in comfort. About Belle Godler, leaving £60,000 to a woman who wasn't even who she claimed to be. About the real Dora Bunner, who I sent away so I could steal her identity and her life. But you didn't succeed, Miss Marple said firmly. No one died. That counts for something, does it? Emma's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion she'd shown. I don't even know anymore. The gun lowered slowly, almost imperceptibly. Inspector Craddock moved swiftly, taking it from her unresisting hand. Emma Stamfordis, false bunny bunner, sank into a chair, all the fight draining out of her. "It's over," she whispered. "Finally it's over." Chapter 11 Aftermath. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as though the darkness of the previous night had been washed away by the spring sunshine. Miss Marple sat in her garden, her knitting in her lap, watching a robin hop about the lawn in search of worms. Inspector Craddock had called earlier to tie up the loose ends. Emma Stamfordis had been taken into custody, though the inspector privately admitted to Miss Marple that he felt a certain sympathy for the woman. She would face trial for attempted murder, but given the circumstances and the fact that no one had actually died, there was hope the sentence might be lenient. She was quite forthcoming once she began talking. Craddock had reported, explained everything. How she'd discovered her father's marriage to Pippa through Belgodler's records. How she'd tracked down information about the inheritance. How she'd found the real Dora Bunner and convinced her to leave the country. It was all meticulously planned, except for the actual murders. She wasn't a natural killer, Miss Marple had observed. That's why her hand shook when she fired the gun. Why she couldn't quite bring herself to use enough poison. She'd convinced herself it was justice, but her conscience wouldn't let her follow through. And what about Pippa Stamfordis? Or rather, the woman calling herself Letitia Blacklock. Miss Marple had sighed. That's more complicated, isn't it? She committed fraud, certainly, by taking another woman's identity. But is it murder to simply allow someone to believe you're dead when you're not? The real Letitia Blacklock died of natural causes. Pippa merely took advantage of the situation. The courts will have to decide that, Craddock had said, though I suspect she'll face charges of fraud and identity theft at minimum. The question is what happens to the inheritance. Now, sitting in her garden, Miss Marple reflected on the tangled web of deception and desperation she'd helped unravel. It reminded her of a case she'd observed many years ago in Much Benham, where two women had switched identities to escape their respective pasts, only to find themselves trapped by the very lies they'd created. The gate clicked open, and Miss Marple looked up to see Julia Simmons approaching, looking wan but composed. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to thank you, properly, before Patrick and I leave St. Mary Mead." "You're leaving?" Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gestured to the garden chair beside her. "We can hardly stay, can we?" Julia sat down heavily. "Everyone knows now that Aunt Letty Pippa, whoever she is, isn't really our relative at all. We have no claim to her estate, no right to be here. And frankly, after everything that's happened, I think a fresh start would be best for both of us." "Where will you go?" "London, probably. Patrick's been offered a position with a shipping company, something his army friend arranged. And I've had a letter from a theatre company in the West End. They want me to audition for a small role." She smiled wanly. "Nothing grand, but it's a beginning. A real beginning this time. Not built on false pretenses. I'm glad to hear it." Miss Marple studied the young woman's face. "You suspected something was wrong, didn't you? That night when you said you wanted to tell the truth, what were you going to reveal?" Julia looked down at her hands. "I'd begun to notice little things. The way Aunt Letty, Pippa, would forget details about the family history. The way she'd tense up whenever anyone mentioned Switzerland or the Girdler family. And there were photographs in her desk, pictures I found when I was looking for stamps. Pictures of a woman who looked like her but wasn't quite right. A bit older, a bit different. I thought perhaps she was hiding something about her past, maybe some scandal. I never imagined she was literally someone else entirely. Did Patrick suspect as well? Not until later. He's cleverer than he seems, Patrick. He started researching our family tree, trying to understand where we fit in. That's when he discovered the inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, stories that couldn't possibly be true, if Aunt Letty was who she said she was. Julia's voice dropped. We were going to confront her, demand the truth. But then the shooting happened, and everything became so confused. And now we just want to leave it all behind. Let the lawyers sort out who's entitled to what. Let Pippa and Emma face the consequences of their actions. She looked directly at Miss Marple. You knew very early on, didn't you, that something was wrong? Miss Marple smiled gently. I suspected. The advertisement in the newspaper was too theatrical, too deliberately strange. And then there was the matter of the pearls. 3 strands, exactly like the ones Pippa Stamfordis was known to wear. When Julia claimed they'd been stolen, I wondered if perhaps they'd never belonged to the family at all, but were something else entirely. But how did you know about Bunny? About Emma? That took longer, Miss Marple admitted, but there were small signs. The way she'd sometimes forget to flutter and fuss, especially when she thought no one was watching. The way she positioned herself in the room during the shooting, close enough to see clearly, but in a spot where the darkness would hide her expression, and most tellingly, the way she recovered so quickly from the poisoning. Dr. Haydock said she had a strong constitution, but I began to wonder if perhaps she'd built up a tolerance to the poison deliberately. You're quite remarkable, Miss Marple. Nonsense. I simply pay attention to people, their habits, their inconsistencies, their small betrayals of character. Human nature is much the same everywhere, whether in a large city or a small village. Once you understand that, mysteries become much easier to unravel. Julia rose to leave. Patrick and I are catching the afternoon train. I don't suppose we'll be back to St. Mary Mead. Too many unpleasant memories. I understand, but I hope you'll both find happiness elsewhere. You're young, and you have your whole lives ahead of you. After Julia left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The robin had found a particularly plump worm and was engaged in a tug-of-war with the earth. She watched it with quiet pleasure, grateful for the simple, uncomplicated dramas of nature. Mrs. Dane Calthrop appeared at the gate, slightly out of breath. Jane, have you heard the latest? They're saying Pippa Stamfordis, the false Miss Blacklock, is going to Switzerland. Apparently there's some legal loophole that means she can't be prosecuted for fraud if she leaves England voluntarily and renounces any claim to the inheritance. That seems a fair resolution, Miss Marple observed. She committed fraud, yes, but out of desperation rather than malice. Let her return to Switzerland and make what life she can there. And the real Dora Bunner has been located in Portugal, quite comfortably settled. She's been told the whole story, and apparently found it all rather exciting. Says it's like something from a novel. Mrs. Dane Calthrop settled herself uninvited on the garden bench. As for Emma Stamfordis, I hear the judge took pity on her, given her difficult upbringing and the fact that no one was seriously harmed. She's been sentenced to 5 years, with the possibility of parole after 3. A mercy, Miss Marple murmured. Is it, though? Mrs. Dane Calthrop looked thoughtful. She tried to commit murder twice. She lived a lie for months, terrorizing a household. Does poverty and resentment excuse all that? No, Miss Marple said firmly. It doesn't excuse it. But understanding why people do terrible things is not the same as excusing them. Emma Stamfordis made terrible choices, born of desperation and a sense of injustice. She'll pay for those choices, but she's also a human being who suffered genuine hardships. Surely that deserves some consideration. Mrs. Dane Calthrop nodded slowly. You're right, of course. You usually are, Jane. It's quite annoying, actually. Miss Marple smiled and returned to her knitting. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, and the garden was peaceful once more. Little paddocks would stand empty for a time, she supposed, until the legal matters were sorted out. Perhaps eventually a new family would move in, bringing fresh life and fresh secrets to the old house. Chapter 12. Reflection. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic events at Little Paddocks, and St. Mary Mead had gradually returned to its customary rhythm. The scandal had provided conversation fodder for every tea party and chance meeting, but even the most sensational gossip eventually exhausts itself, and the village moved on to other concerns. Mrs. Price's prize roses, the upcoming summer fete, young Tommy Brent's engagement to the butcher's daughter. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window, a cup of tea growing cold on the table beside her. She was ostensibly working on her knitting, another pair of booties for her great-niece, but her needles moved slowly, and her gaze kept drifting to the world beyond her cottage window. Inspector Craddock had written to her just that morning, a courtesy she appreciated. The letter lay open on her lap, and she'd read it through twice already. Dear Miss Marple, I thought you would wish to know the final disposition of the Little Paddocks affair. As you predicted, the courts have shown a measure of mercy to all parties involved. Emma Stamfordis received a sentence of 5 years for attempted murder, though the judge noted her lack of criminal history and the mitigating circumstances of her upbringing. Her barrister made much of the fact that she'd been denied her rightful place in her father's life, and that the psychological damage of such rejection had contributed to her actions. She accepted the sentence with dignity, and I'm told has been a model prisoner thus far. There's talk she may train as a librarian while incarcerated, a more peaceful profession than nursing. Perhaps Pippa Stamfordis, I can hardly call her Letitia Blacklock now, has indeed returned to Switzerland. The Crown Prosecution Service decided that pursuing fraud charges would be costly and ultimately unsatisfying, given that she's voluntarily renounced all claims to both the Blacklock estate and the Gödler inheritance. She left England quietly, and I understand she's taken a position as a companion to an elderly woman in Montreux. Perhaps she'll live honestly from now on, though who can say? The £60,000 from Belle Gödler's estate remains in legal limbo. The solicitors are attempting to determine whether Emma Stamfordis, as George Stamfordis's illegitimate daughter, has any claim to it. The case may drag on for years. In the meantime, the money sits in trust, helping no one. Patrick and Julia Simmons have settled in London, as you probably know. Young Patrick has proved himself surprisingly capable in his new position, and Julia has secured several small roles in West End productions. They write to me occasionally. They seem genuinely relieved to be free of the whole business. The real Dora Bunner has chosen to remain in Portugal. She says the weather agrees with her rheumatism, and she's made friends with several other English expatriates. She bears no ill will toward anyone, which speaks well of her character, or perhaps of her general obliviousness to the gravity of what occurred. Little Paddocks stands empty, awaiting the resolution of various legal questions about ownership. I suspect it will be some time before anyone lives there again. And finally, Miss Marple, I must thank you once more for your invaluable assistance. Your observations were crucial to solving this case, though I confess I didn't always appreciate them at the time. You have a remarkable gift for seeing through to the heart of human nature. With sincere gratitude and respect, Detective Inspector Dermot Craddock. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Through her window, she could see Miss Weatherby hurrying past with her shopping basket, and Colonel Easterbrook engaged in heated discussion with the postman about the proper way to prune a hedge. Ordinary life, ordinary concerns, ordinary kindnesses, and petty grievances. And yet beneath that ordinariness, Miss Marple knew, ran deeper currents of desperation, ambition, fear, and longing. Every person who passed her window carried their own secrets, their own sorrows, their own capacity for both goodness and evil. The door opened, and Cherry Baker entered with a fresh pot of tea. "You've been sitting there for an hour, miss, and haven't drunk a drop. Shall I make you something to eat?" "No, thank you, Cherry. The tea is perfect." Miss Marple accepted a fresh cup gratefully. "Tell me, what are people saying about the little Paddocks affair now?" Cherry needed no further encouragement. She settled herself comfortably against the sideboard, ready for a good gossip. "Well, Mrs. Butt at the bakery says she knew all along there was something wrong with Miss Blacklock. Said she had foreign eyes, whatever that means. And Mrs. Finch at the post office swears she suspected Bunny was an imposter because she once mailed a letter addressed in handwriting that didn't match her other letters." Miss Marple suppressed a smile. In hindsight, everyone in the village had apparently suspected everything. "And what do you think, Cherry?" The girl considered this seriously. "I think people are complicated, miss. That Emma Stamfordess, she did wrong, no question. But when I heard about her growing up poor, knowing her father had another family he cared about more, well, it made me think of my cousin Gladys. Her dad ran off with another woman when she was little, and Gladys has been angry about it her whole life. She's not a murderer or anything, but she's bitter. It poisons everything for her." "That's very perceptive, Cherry. And that Pippa woman, I suppose she did wrong too, pretending to be someone she wasn't. But she was desperate, wasn't she? And she didn't actually hurt anyone, not really. She gave those young people a home, was kind to Bunny, or the woman she thought was Bunny. That's got to count for something." "I believe it does," Miss Marple agreed. After Cherry left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her thoughts remained with the case. She considered the various players in the drama, each driven by their own needs and fears. Emma, seeking justice for old wounds and financial security. Pippa, grasping at a comfortable life after years of hardship. Patrick and Julia, trying to find their place in a world that had shown them little kindness. Even the real Dora Bunner, innocently enjoying Portuguese sunshine, unaware that someone had stolen her identity. None of them were entirely innocent, but none were entirely guilty either. They were simply human, flawed, desperate, occasionally cruel, occasionally kind. Miss Marple thought of a sermon the vicar had given years ago about judgment and mercy. He'd quoted something from the Bible. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." At the time, she'd thought it rather obvious. But now, having seen so much of human nature in her long life, she understood its wisdom more deeply. She thought of little Paddocks, standing empty on the edge of the village. The house itself was innocent of any wrongdoing. It was simply a building, brick and mortar, where various human dramas had played out. Would new people move in eventually? Would they know its history? Or would the story fade into legend, growing more distorted with each retelling? In the garden, the robin had returned, and Miss Marple watched it with affection. Nature was so much simpler than human society. The robin didn't lie about its identity or plot murder for inheritance money. It simply existed following its instincts, surviving as best it could. But humans, Miss Marple reflected, were different. They had the capacity for deception, yes, but also for redemption. Emma Stamfordis might emerge from prison a better person, having faced the consequences of her actions. Pippa might find peace in Switzerland, living simply and honestly under her true name. Patrick and Julia might build good lives, having learned from the chaos that had surrounded them. Or perhaps not. Human nature was adaptable, but not always capable of change. Some lessons were learned, others ignored. Some sins were atoned for, others repeated endlessly. The afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across Miss Marple's sitting room. She set aside her knitting and rose to draw the curtains, but paused for a moment, looking out at the village she'd called home for so many decades. St. Mary Mead looked peaceful in the gathering dusk. Lights were coming on in cottage windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere else a child laughed. Ordinary life continued as it always did, regardless of scandal or tragedy or murder. People went on living, working, loving, betraying, forgiving. The great wheel of human existence turned steadily onward. And Miss Marple, who had seen so much of human nature in all its complexity, felt a deep and abiding compassion for all of them, the guilty and the innocent alike, all struggling to find their way through the complications of existence. "We are all of us," she murmured to herself, "so very human." She drew the curtains closed, shutting out the gathering darkness, and turned back to the warmth and light of her sitting room. Tomorrow would bring new puzzles, new observations, new insights into the endlessly fascinating study of human nature. But for tonight, she was content to sit by her fire with her knitting and her memories, grateful for the quiet wisdom that came with age, and hopeful that somewhere in the wide world, justice and mercy might occasionally walk hand in hand. The case of Little Paddocks was closed. Life in St. Mary Mead went on, and Miss Jane Marple, that most unlikely and most perceptive of detectives, was ready for whatever mysteries the future might bring.